Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Talks with Walt, as we are calling our now reading through the deathbed edition of Leaves of Grass. We now turn to Song of Myself, passage number 27, one of the more intriguing little poems of Song of Myself. Sections 26 through 38, we've already said, are kind of the poet's microscopic vision of, moving from the commonplace or ordinary life to some kind of mystical significance. Put it in your notes though, passage 27, 20, 29, and 30 are seen as kind of a collection in which Whitman specifically is interested in the power of touch, the sense of touch. Now I just want to remind us again that when we're doing this study, Whitman is going to have said in passage 4 that he loves to consider himself both in and out of the game and watching and wondering at it. And then he says, I witness and wait. Now this witnessing is a whole lot of what's going on in passages 27, 28, 29, and 30. I'm hoping you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net. I'm hoping down that left-hand side, Talks with Walt is our playlist for this set of talks. I'm hoping that you are with me for the inscriptions, 24 poems, the 19 sections of Pomenok, as well as the Song of Myself up through passage 26. We just finished with passage 26. Consider this. We just finished with some observations about the power of music. I love to ask gamers, what would it be like to play your favorite game without the power of music, without the ability to hear the music? I have gamers that will say, if you remove my ability to enjoy the music, the game is less than enjoyable for me. Obviously the question is why? What is it about music that elicits that power? Now we're going to move from what we listen to what we touch in this one. Now we're going to have in passages 27, 29, and 30 these short bursts, observations, insights we might say. Passage 28 that we'll get to next is a certain kind of crisis text that I'm borrowing heavily from the work of Harold Bloom here to point out that there's something going on that is challenging and is disturbing. I think Whitman is beginning to show us some of the raw emotional states that he is struggling with. And this final line of passage 27 has always been much debated. Let's just enjoy the poem. To be in any form, what is that? Round and round we go, all of us, and ever come back thither. If nothing lay more developed, the quaog in its callous shell were enough. Mine is no callous shell. I have instant conductors all over me, whether I pass or stop. They seize every object and lead it harmlessly through me. I merely stir, press, feel with my fingers, and am happy. To touch my person to someone else's is about as much as I can stand. Now we obviously are going to have to mess around with that final line. Is it a happy line? Is it a disturbingly sad line? We'll have to ask which way you like to read it. Hey guys, I'm hoping that you have your own copy of Leaves of Grass and you're annotating it all up. And as you get to a line like that last one of passage 27, you kind of force yourself to go, how do I read that line, and to what degree does that line resonate for me? Of course, to speak of resonating, and Whitman loved this kind of thing. Notice the first two words of this section, to be in any form, what is that? Which will obviously make us think about the famous lines from Hamlet, from Shakespeare's Hamlet, the third act soliloquy, to be or not to be, that is the question. And of course you can go back and study what we have to say at learnstrong.net about that set of lines. But I just want to point out that we finished passage number 26 with this question of being or ontology, and here we are back again playing the same game. Notice, to be in any form, what is that? Now let's make two quick observations for your notes. One is a to be observation. Notice the power of the rhetorical question. Whitman loves to imagine that he's writing these poems directly with you, the reader, in conversation. And he asks the rhetorical question directly to you. I think he learned how to do this, Whitman, much from his study of Shakespeare. Hamlet is a classic example, where Hamlet will almost seem to want to reach out to the audience to ask these kinds of questions to make them think. Secondly, we're to form. And the moment we see the word form, we're going to obviously circle it in our volume. Because the moment we see the word form, we cannot help but think of Plato's Republic, books 6 and 7, of course, and the theory of the forms. That is to say, our two-box theory. Go back to our lecture in Dolan's where we'll introduce some of those concepts, the Platonist ideas. That is to say, this dualism that Whitman loves to play with. There is, of course, the world of form, and then there is the world of the formless. That is to say, a beautiful Sports Illustrated swimsuit model or a beautiful male model is, of course, in the first box. That is to say, something you can see, touch, we won't get into it, the five senses. But in the second box, we're going to put that concept beauty there itself. So Whitman's going to begin by asking, what's up with this form thing? What really difference does it make? And then in parentheses or in parenthetics, the only line that's not part of the 1855 edition, round and round we go, all of us, and ever come back thither. Now that is an interesting line. In other words, there's so many different ways you can read this. Some have read this as his belief in reincarnation. When you marry it, especially to passage 6 of Song of Myself, his comments about death and dying. There is no death. Here, notice, there is this round and round idea, the circles idea, which will take us obviously to Emerson's essay Circles. We've given full comments on that one elsewhere. The idea that everything transcends and includes is the language of Ken Wilber and his integralist philosophy that we love in 303. But notice, in other words, we're always moving forward, but we always seem to come back to where we started. If nothing lay more developed, and of course the word nothing we've heard already in Leaves of Grass a number of times, if nothing lay more developed, the Queog, an Atlantic coast clam by the way, in its callous shell were enough. Now, in passage 48, we're going to hear this comment about to glance with an eye or show a bean in its pod confounds the learning of all times. Whitman loves this kind of thing. He loves to be able to kind of euphemistically reduce all of science down to a single, oh yeah, well can you explain the quag and its callous shell? And if you can't explain that, then how can you explain anything else? By the way, let's just point out here that we're still working with the Darwinian scientific revolution that is happening during Whitman's time. And then notice he will then move to a new set of 3 lines. And he then will go from the quig and its callous shell to himself. Mine is no callous shell. I think it's an important observation. Earlier he said that he's not stuck up. Here he's going to tell us that he's not a shell that's callous. In other words, I am susceptible. The poet, the artist, is open, we might say. And then he's going to use more scientific language. I have instant conductors all over me, whether I pass or stop. In other words, a tuning fork is the word picture he'll use elsewhere in Leaves of Grass. This idea that as I go out among people, I am this observer. Again, go back to that passage 4. As he says it, I witness and wait. He's always listening. He's always paying attention. And he says, I have instant conductors all over me, whether I pass or stop. These conductors seize. It's an interesting word. Go back and look at the number of times this word gets used in Leaves of Grass. It's quite fascinating. We've seen it already. Grabbing, seizing, wrestling, all of these kind of really masculine types of terms. They seize every object and lead it harmlessly through me. Now, this echoing that we've already talked about so many times before, I mean, think about this one. From passage number 2 of Song of Myself, he says, you shall no longer take things at second or third hand, or look through the eyes of the dead, nor feed on the spectre in books. You shall not look through my eyes either, nor take things from me. And then that final line of passage 2, you shall listen to all sides and filter them from yourself. Now, it's interesting that the preposition there is from, and here it's through. But the same game is being played, and notice Whitman is saying, I do as the poet what I'm challenging you to do as the reader. Then he will finish with 2 lines that start with this merely word. Now he loves this, so pay attention to the way he does this. It's this epistemological fallibilism that we talked about earlier. I think I'm right, but I could be wrong. It's that I could be wrong part that makes it so interesting, where he says, you know what? All I'm really doing is, he's so understated as he says this, I merely stir. This is what the artist does. I merely stir, press, feel with my fingers. Obviously, this could be some sexual language. Many have read this as autoerotic, right? And am happy, right? In other words, he says, I can take care of making myself happy by simply stirring, pressing, and feeling with my fingers. Again, the sexual rendering here I'll leave to you and your own reading of this. But then we move to the final line. To touch my person to someone else's is about as much as I can stand. Now, as I've said already in earlier lectures, Harold Bloom, the great critiquer of Whitman, the great lover of Whitman, has been very influential in much of my reading, especially of passages like this one. Notice the genius of this. First of all, he is going to continue to talk about the Scooby Snacks of Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Scooby Snacks, right? So notice here we've got his interest in happy. What is it that makes me happy? But then the next line, to touch my person to someone else's is about as much as I can stand. Now, notice the both positive rendering of this, that is to say, it's the most amazing thing to touch my body to another person. But there's also a potential pejorative or negative rendering of this. I can hardly do it. I mean, we use that kind of language, don't we? Sometimes when we say, you know, it's about all I can take. It's about all I can stand. Whitman here will give us an indication that as a poet, as an artist, he is trying to conduct as much information through him, through touch, as he can. Now, if we said that there's multiple ways of listening in our last discussion in 26, we'll say here that there's multiple ways of touching in passage 27. We're going to get to more of this in 28 in a little bit, and the power of the human touch. Let's just finish now at 2a. Obviously, the artist is the great conductor, as we have said in the lecture itself. That is to say, always listening, always feeling, always touching, always attempting to find happiness. At 2b, well, I'm going to just point out the power of the echoes here. And as we get on now into the passages 28, 29, and 30, I'm going to try to challenge you. Where are the echoes? You know you've heard stuff like this before. This use of the word merely, for example. You know you've heard this before. There becomes a certain kind of cadence. Think of it. You are now halfway through the 52 sections of Song of Myself. Congratulations, by the way, for making it with me. But there will be echoes that will be drawing from earlier passages of Song of Myself. And of course, all of those earlier lines, the 24 poems of inscriptions, the 19 sections of Paumanok as well. At 3a, we can relate this to, of course we've said Hamlet's to be or not to be passage, but I want to relate it to who Whitman loved so much, the great poet Tennyson, and especially that passage from Ulysses. I am part of all that I've met, yet all experiences an arch where through gleams of the untroubled world is margins fades forever and forever when I move. How dull it is to pause to make an end, to rest unburnished, not to shine in youth. As though to breathe were life. Life piled on life were all too little, and of one to me little remains, but every hour saved from that eternal silence something more, and bringer of new things, and violet were for some 3 suns to store and hoard myself, and this gray spirit yearning and desire to follow knowledge like a sinking star beyond the utmost bounds of human thought. No question, Whitman will love lines like this, and they will be playing around with this idea that he is somehow a part of everything, right? And that is his following knowledge like a sinking star, trying to listen from the earlier poem, and now touch, feel. In other words, the capacity to feel. Which leads us finally to 3b. When was the last time in your life that touch, physical touch, actually mattered? Can you remember it? For example, watch these questions. Who was it with? Where did it happen? When did it happen? And maybe most intriguingly, why did it happen? It's funny because I'll ask students this question sometimes from the study of this passage. And they have to admit, you know, it's really weird. It's been a long time since I touched another human being. I mean, I used to give my mom a hug on the way out the door to school, but one stops doing that silliness, of course, when one is in middle school. And then quickly one comes to the realization, it's been a long time since I've actually felt anything. I have become the callous shell. I've closed myself off from the world, and I no longer feel anything. Whitman says, it is painful in some profound way to open yourself up, to make yourself vulnerable to the world, to the pain of the world, to the joy of the world, and yet it is necessary. Now, of course, when you do that, opening yourself up to not be the callous shell, you do find yourself, of course, with a potential crisis. We're going to turn now to passage 28 and ask, are we going to witness a certain kind of crisis here of Whitman? Thank you.